meaning that because of biases and injustices, it can work different in different environments. So there's a real potential to cause harm, both to individuals by AI algorithms being wrong, and kind of more generally by perpetuating and amplifying societal injustice, exclusion, and bias. Here's a couple of quick examples of where AI doesn't always work. So this was a GPT-3 example put out by a company by NABLA, thankfully not in live clinical care. On the left, you see someone saying they feel sad and given a recommendation of recycling to help because Americans get paid to recycle and that humans like that. And on the right, a far worse one where someone is basically told to kill themselves by the chatbot. Again, happy that this wasn't in live time, but just a clear example of how this can go wrong. And then AI doesn't always work for everyone. So this is from Leo Selly and colleagues at MIT, who I've started to work with, and wonderful collaborators. And this was a study they found where an algorithm was consistently missing pneumonias on chest x-rays of Black patients more than white patients. And so they looked into this and they said, well, how is this happening? And it turns out the AI algorithm was identifying a self-reported race based on the images alone, which is remarkable because we as human beings, as radiologists, that's not something that we understand humans to be able to do. And the thing that's even more frightening is they took these images, they obscured them and made them, they used a variety of different ways to kind of blur the images. You can see here that on the top row, the HPF 50, which is letter D on the top, if you can see, that's a high pass filter of 50, essentially not discernible to a human being as an X-ray anymore, and is still having an 80 to 90% rate of being able to predict self-reported race of the patient for whom that picture came from, which is terrifying in so many ways. And really what it means is that algorithms are operating on things that we can't see, right? So algorithms can operate in ways that we don't understand. They can operate on hidden information, and they are seeing things that we don't see, which makes this unbelievably challenging, I think, to really wrap our minds around. So then what does that mean for IRBs? Why, that's the reason that I'm here. And how do we review research involving IRBs? So I put up this picture, and when I sent the slides around, I actually, my point was proven very nicely, which is someone responded to me when I circulated these slides and said, oh, I really love the pictures of the llamas. And I thought that was great because actually it's one llama and it's one alpaca. And now there are some people in the room who may be like animal experts who could really stand up and say, well, I can tell you the difference and why these are so different and why one's an llama and why one's an alpaca. And other people are going to say, well, these look exactly the same. And I think that's relevant to reviewing research studies involving AI, because first we have to be able to identify when AI is actually being involved and actually being able to see there is AI involved here and it's something we need to think about and it is different. And on the other hand, there's lots of similarities, and the way that an IRB approaches a study involving AI is going to be also very similar to how we approach all of our other studies. So think about the llama and the alpaca and the similarities and the differences. Things that are similar, we're going to go through, is it human subjects research? Is it FDA regulated? Does it meet the regulatory criteria for approval? Things that are different, we're going to talk about some special considerations for AI research that we need to see. There's also questions that come up more broadly than IRBs for HRPPs and institutions. Is this actually the IRB's role to solve these problems? If it's not the IRB's role, whose problem is it to solve? And as we already heard a little bit about this morning, are the regulations actually sufficient for governing this type of work? And what type of regulatory changes do we need to allow us to do this work the way we think we should be able to? So I'm not going to spend time on is it human subjects research. I wasn't planning to, and I was so glad that Julie gave such a wonderful presentation of that. Basically, we think about this the same way we do any other research. Is it identifiable or not? Is it public data or not? Is there an intervention or interaction with a participant or not? Are you trying to collect data in a systematic way and create generalized information or not? We basically use the same kind of premise with all the caveats that Julie mentioned this morning that I think are so important. Is it FDA regulated or not? This comes up all the time. This is probably the thing we spend the most time talking about. And I like to shift the question a little bit. And so rather than saying, is it FDA regulated or not, I'm going to ask the question of, at which point in the AI model life cycle is it becoming FDA regulated? What point does it become subject to FDA oversight? And Adam gave a really great model of the AI life cycle, better than the one I'm going to show you in a couple of slides. But you can basically think about where you are in the course of that life cycle to try to help answer this question. So here, that's actually the slide. So you can ask yourself some questions around FDA device regulations. The standard medical device regulations apply. FDA has guidance on this. It's constantly evolving, but asking questions around, has this been approved before for the same purpose, for a different purpose? What phase of the research are we in the AI model lifecycle? So it is probably very different when you're in the planning and data acquisition and preparation stages than it may be when you're in the building and training stages, than when it may be when you're in the evaluation and validation stages, than when you are in the deployment stages. And there's a continuum, right? And so trying to figure out where you can draw the lines between these continuums. Thinking about where the actual algorithm is being studied. So is it happening in shadow mode where it's totally separate from clinical care and has no impact on clinical care whatsoever? Is it side by side with routine clinical decision making where it's not directly impacting clinical care, but it's there in the environment? Or is it actually having a direct impact on medical decision making? Those are all going to be relevant considerations to how the FDA regulations get parsed out here. Are people planning to submit data to the FDA? If you do submit to the FDA, how far back are they going to go? Maybe actually what I said earlier about the distinction between planning and data acquisition is irrelevant, because maybe the FDA will go back to the very beginning. And I know that there are different institutions handling this differently. So we, I think, have taken that conservative position that basically the FDA may go back to the very beginning. We're going to probably consider this FDA regulated from the very, very start in many times. Other institutions I've seen, they'll say submit one protocol for the first part, submit a second protocol for the second part, and we're going to parse that out. I think there's some interesting questions there. Part of this does come down to, I think, what Adam was actually mentioning, which is what is the plan? What is the commercialization plan? Often we don't know at the beginning what the commercialization plan is. And so it's actually even hard to answer these questions from the very beginning. Thinking about whether there's corporate funding can make a difference there. And a little bit incidental, but I like to think about just a very practical IRB point about what a device brochure actually looks like if you're thinking this is FDA regulated, and how do you create a device brochure for something that's constantly changing, right? We think of a device brochure as this like static thing that describes the device. In this case, by the time they submit the brochure to you, it's outdated because the algorithm's already learned and changed. So it's a lot of questions, I think, about FDA device regulations. We created this algorithm to try to help our investigators in radiology to just think a little bit about this. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. Radiology, almost all of the clinical decision support tools they use are considered devices by the FDA because they're operating on an image. So they're considered either software as a medical device or device clinical decision support. And so we kind of use this to go through with our radiology investigators to say, you really need to think from the beginning about, is your algorithm meeting the definition of an FDA medical device? If so, are you studying the safety or effectiveness? If you're not studying the safety or effectiveness, perhaps actually, I don't know if this has a pointer on it. I could try to point, but oh, that didn't work. I'll try not. So the second box from the top on the right, this is what Adam was saying, and I think what the question was saying, if the algorithm has already been trained and tested and validated and all the research is done with appropriate clinical leadership, you can potentially deploy this in the real world, and what you're doing may just be QI, QA, or ongoing monitoring and ongoing improvements, and that's not the setting. Chances are the medical device regulations in the FDA for your research study are going to apply. And then the question of, is it ID exempt because it's not touching clinical care and it's making a diagnosis, but with an alternative standard diagnosis, or is it going to have to go to the IRB or the FDA for a non-significant risk or a significant risk determination? Next, doesn't meet the regulatory criteria for approval. This is probably a little small for you all to see, but you all are familiar with the 111 criteria, the regulatory criteria for approval that are based on our standard ethical principles. And so I've included here kind of basically some AI research considerations or examples of what we should be thinking about when we're applying the regulatory criteria for approval. So in terms of risks to subjects being minimized, thinking about appropriate information security precautions, as Adam was alluding to, appropriate clinical oversight when the algorithms are impacting medical care, thinking about individual privacy risks, for risk-benefit ratio, thinking about individual privacy risks, potential to cause individual harm. There's a potential for benefit at a broad level. There's also possible potential for risk at a broad level that I'll talk about a little bit later, which is interesting to think about whether we can include here. Issues of justice regarding representative data sets, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all of these because my subsequent slides kind of touch upon some of these in more detail, but I just wanted to kind of share that this is one of the similarities between this work and all of our other work, which is we think about how do we apply the regulatory criteria for approval? What does it actually mean in the context of reviewing something with AI? So here's some of the special considerations. So privacy and confidentiality of data, you just heard a little bit about in a couple of the talks we've had today. To reiterate that OpenAI platforms are not HIPAA compliant. And really, I think the fear here is that because of the big data involved and the power of this generative AI and the power of the computing is the increased probability of re-identification, essentially, and whether de-identification actually is a concept that can exist in this world any longer. And I think that's where the privacy and confidentiality of data and drives so many of these decisions. It's why many at large academic medical centers, including our own, have essentially prohibited the use of open AI platforms for both identifiable and de-identified information, or really any confidential business information. Instead, as Adam alluded to, recommending running these algorithms on internal computing infrastructure, though that raises really interesting questions, as was brought up around, well, what happens after you validate your algorithm and you want to commercialize it or put it into the open source? Still requires a lot of multidisciplinary review. Another special consideration is we use huge amounts of unconsented data to do this work. So almost by definition, these projects start with acquisition and processing of large existing data sets that are used for training, building and training purposes. When we think about data use generally as an IRB, we're thinking about justification for data use, right? And minimum necessary requirements for data use. That's really complicated here, because here, actually, the more data you feed these things, the better they work. And so what exactly does minimum necessary look like? Often the data is unconsented from it's medical record data. It's often de-identified or anonymized, although, as I mentioned, I'm not sure that concept really is very reassuring or useful in generative AI. And so that really raises questions around, are non-human subjects determinations really appropriate or plausible in this world of potential re-identification? And it really, I think, poses significant concerns around this future use of the data, around sharing. And so, when you're developing the model, so we say, okay, well, you need to do it on your internal computer infrastructure, but then what happens when you want to commercialize it or move it to open source? And the two comparisons that came to my mind when I was thinking about this, one is the NIH genomic data sharing policy and the consent restrictions on broad use and future sharing of that data. The other is the common rule requirement for consent for whole genome sequencing and whole exome sequencing. And if you think about, well, why do those things exist, right? They exist probably because of the private nature of the data, the personal nature of the data, the likelihood of re-identification of the data, right? All those same things probably apply here. And so you have to start wondering, well, should some of those same consent requirements potentially apply? Incredibly difficult to say that in real world practice, and thinking more about, and this came up earlier too, should we actually be working toward kind of the creation of large consented data sets to be able to do this AI development instead? Return of individual research results. So as I kind of showed you in those examples, one of the amazing things here is these AI diagnostic models can see things that we can't see. And so you're going to get results back that we didn't catch, basically. And the question is, what should we do with that? Should we return those results to patients? Comes down a little bit to how confident are we in the validity of the results. We have to weigh the potential risks of having to kind of redo testing and more worry versus benefits, improve treatment if it's available. Thinking about who those results would go back to. Would they go back to the radiologist or the pathologist to have another read done? Or would they go to the treating clinician or directly to the patient? And the consent part comes in here again too, because often you're going to say, well, what did the consent form say? And then if it's unconsented data, is the person even identifiable? Can you even find them to return the result? And if you can, how do you communicate a finding to an unconsented patient? Actually, a very, very difficult conversation to have. And so again, maybe we say, if you're going to do a study where we think there's a really high likelihood that you're going to find things you didn't find before, maybe we need to be doing it on a consented data set instead. Algorithmic bias, we've heard a lot about today. I'm just going to get into it a little bit to say, essentially, I think the quote unquote solution to algorithmic bias is to use transparency, explainability, and independent review. You heard a little bit about explainability earlier, which is the idea that the algorithm can kind of explain how it's making its decisions and what it does. Generative AI really pushes that limit. And really, I think Barbara, you asked the question of, well, what do you do about, how do you monitor for the bias, or what do you do? And so there are programs to do algorithmic auditing, essentially. And the problem with algorithmic auditing is it's incredibly complex. I don't think IRBs really have the expertise for this. Even if IRBs do have the expertise, we don't actually get the algorithms, right? If you think about the protocols we get, the protocols are nowhere near the actual algorithm. And if we wanted them, will people actually give them to us for proprietary reasons? I don't know, is the question. We haven't asked. Should that fall to us? Should that fall to other groups? And I do think this is where open source tools are needed. To Barbara's point, I'm very fortunate to work in an incredibly well-resourced institution where we have lots of support. There's lots of IRBs out there that don't have that. We put in a grant recently with our colleagues from MIT to try to create some open source tools that people at IRBs may be able to use to at least start doing a little bit of this work instead of kind of just putting our heads in the sand. I do think that when you're doing a clinical trial of an AI algorithm, participants have to be informed of the risk of potential bias. And that last one here is adverse event monitoring. So essentially, when an adverse event happens, asking the question of, did the algorithm act as expected or not? Or was it more of a non-directed or emergent behavior, as we would say, where the algorithm is kind of doing its own thing? Again, this requires explainability to try to understand whether the result came because of the way it was designed or not. And it really requires thinking about a carefully detailed monitoring plan, essentially a continuous monitoring plan. What are the anticipated mistakes? What is the plan for retraining if you start seeing things kind of going astray? How are unanticipated problems going to be handled? And then I think this last data point is a really important one. And I think Julie brought this up this morning too, which is this question of, and what about adverse events essentially to others, to non-subjects, to future groups, basically, right? So when you're doing a study designing an algorithm, the bias in that algorithm is probably not impacting the person whose data got trained, or even potentially where you're studying it for the first time, kind of in the phase 3 study equivalent. But when you get it approved and then you commercialize it or you put it in open source, the bias is going to affect other people down the line who are using it. And so how do we consider that kind of risk of future community or group harm? The next two slides I'm not going to spend a ton of time on because otherwise I'll run out of time, but essentially to say, what do we actually need in a protocol? And the bottom line here is a lot more than we usually get. I'm not going to read through all of this, and we can circulate slides so you have it, but basically it's all the things I just said, which is this, where did the technology come from? Is it available? What's the current phase of the study? Is it a real world clinical trial? Is it in shadow mode? Is it informing or driving care? Is it, what's the clinical backup and decision-making, et cetera, et cetera? What should be in the consent form? I do think that when we, as much as we can, when we consent people, we need to disclose that AI is being used, how it's being used, what data sets it was trained on, again, what the anticipated and unanticipated risks will be, limitations of privacy, potential for re-identifiability. And then there's some new work that I've been doing on something called model cards and team cards, which is essentially lay versions of basically telling people what the models actually do and who built the models. So actually transparency into the teams who built the models so people can really understand where these things came from. So I'm going to wrap up by just kind of asking the question of whose job is this? So we've already heard a little bit about AI governance. I'm glad to say there's a lot of people working on this, federal and state laws. That's hard governance. IRBs are kind of considered soft governance. I think we need more hard governance for us to be able to enforce and do this work. And then what would it look like for us to really take this on? So beyond kind of our usual review, which is I think what I said up till this point, what it would really look like for us to take this on? So again, here's an example of an AI life cycle. And I think what it would really look like is this, which is essentially we need policies and tools at every step of the way to do data bias checking and bias mitigation and explainers. And there's just a lot of checking that essentially has to do that's not getting done right now if we really want to kind of promote transparency and bias mitigation throughout the life cycle. There's a lot of challenges to that. There's a huge tension between regulation and innovation here. The more we try to regulate, the more pushback we're going to get that we're standing in the way of innovation. And that's happening outside the course of IRBs and academic medical centers also. It requires a ton of expertise. As Adam alluded to, it requires a lot of collaboration. It's between us, researchers, clinicians, regulators, others. It requires constant ongoing oversight because, as I said, these models change with time. So you can't just do this at the beginning, and maybe a continuing review might not be enough. There has to be some sort of kind of ongoing monitoring. And it does, I think, require some regulatory change if we were going to kind of roll up our sleeves and try to get into this. Some of the ongoing regulatory questions I have are some of which have been already alluded to. So many of these models are developed with retrospective or secondary use data. They're considered either exempt research or non-human subjects research. And I wonder if that's really what these regulations had in mind when they were written. I don't think they were written and thought of way before this whole world of generative AI research, right? And so the research may be compliant. We may be able to see something that is compliant, but is that really adequately protective? And how do the regulations need to be updated to maybe not allow things to kind of skirt around full review? HIPAA waiver for research is really interesting. This came up a little bit earlier, but and I think there was a question that Adam answered around this question about retained PHI essentially within algorithms, right? So we do a HIPAA waiver. People train their data sets on our internal servers. Then they want to go commercialize them, and do those algorithms retain information about our patients, and what do you do about that? When we have to sign off on a HIPAA waiver, it does have this, it has a determination around data being destroyed at the earliest possible time, right, without appropriate justification. And so what does that look like in this case? Because maybe the data would never be destroyed if these algorithms kind of live forever. And then finally, this question about risk to participants in the study versus risks generated by future applications of AI. The regulations would say the IRBs are not supposed to go there, but so the question as to are we allowed to go there, or should we go there? I think that much of the risk actually is to the future groups and populations, and so I think these are things that regulatory changes are likely needed for. So just a few take-home points, and then I'll wrap up. I'm sure I'm over time. Basically, there are awesome potentials here. There's scary problems. AI has the potential to cause harm by having incorrect answers or by perpetuating bias. I think independent review and accountability is critical. That's where you all come in. This is where IRBs come in. For better or worse, we are one of the few kind of required independent review processes. And so what does it mean for us? I think that we have to build capacity around this. We have to expand our competencies around this, developing standard operating procedures for AI research, both templates for protocols and consent forms, what you should see, also templates for reviewers and reviewer worksheets. We should engage with our researchers. We need to tell them what we're thinking about and educate them about the regulations that we are trying to enforce. We also need to learn from them about what they're doing. So I think there's a two-way collaboration and education process needed there. We have to engage institutional leadership and information security and regulators, et cetera. This problem clearly does not just fall to IRBs. You should not all have to worry alone about this. We need to work together on it. And toward that end, we all have to stay up to date with our evolving regulations and norms, and conferences like this help with that. So thanks so much for your time and attention. And I do want to just acknowledge my colleagues here.
All right. Okay. All right, I'm going to get, for my folks in the room, you will notice that there was a tool dropped off at your tables. For those online, I'm sorry, all I have is the Zoom poll for you, but it's coming, so don't you worry. So we are going to enter a adventure together where we're going to think about how the IRB office may be able to use AI as part of its operations. And within that, I'm going to include staff and IRB committees themselves. The fun part about thinking about this specific topic is that we actually don't have amazing examples yet about how IRBs and IRB offices are doing this, unless you all are secretly doing it and you just haven't shared your amazing AI yet, which is possible. So what I'm trying to do today is think about and put you all in a number of scenarios where you could think about the possible. So as we take this adventure together, I'm going to give a few just things that we have to think about that are in the background about the IRB and HRPP landscape right now. But there are a few rules. One is you have to vote. So you have to make a decision, and don't worry, I've given a middle option. So for all of us who always say it depends, you have that choice, okay? For those of you who are in the room and have a prop, you have to wave it side to side because you only have a yes/no option on your tool. So you're going to just have to wave it around if you're indecisive and you're not quite sure where you're going to land. But so that's rule one, is you have to vote. And rule two is think about, even I tend to have a visceral reaction to many of these ideas, but think about, is there a positive nugget in the example? And what might that look like? I don't think we're going to be the first place, clearly. There's lots of AI activity going on, and we haven't been the first stop as IRB offices or HRPPs to test out these innovations. But I do think we have to really give some serious thought to how they could help our work. We're going to be dealing with them. So think, if you always have an inclination to turn to the no, push yourself to say, if I had to pick one of these, might there be a yes? So I wanted to start off and just give a little bit of background in terms of what are IRBs and HRPPs dealing with right now? And I actually think we're in a really tremendous time of change in terms of what the IRB and HRPP office and committees actually look like. So I just put a few of the examples of things that are kind of going on in our world. We know we have potential regulatory change coming from the FDA, and that change could increase the number of times where institutions have to think about relying on external IRBs for a portion of their research. We know that there's an interest, a growing interest, in trying to figure out how you can establish whether IRBs are actually effective at doing their job at all. And there's an increased interest in data from IRBs about their work. So we're in a time where we know organizations, IRBs, might be making decisions about, do I need a committee at all? Do I need to change my staffing? I may be in a tough budget at time. How do I have to think about that in terms of the tools that I decide I want to use? So with that backdrop, we're going to go through a number of scenarios, and you will get an opportunity to vote on each. So for those who are online, you'll see a Zoom poll open with your options for each of these scenarios. I will get a little feedback about how you all voted, and I can see those in the room. And you can decide instantaneously what you want your vote to be, or you can give yourself a minute to digest. So here's our first case. The IRB at an academic medical center constantly struggles in its review of consent forms to simplify complex medical terminology into lay terms. They decide to actively use an AI tool to improve the consent readability. The tool is able to generate less complex phrasing and to do so in a way that does not dramatically impact the consent length. The IRB runs complex phrasing through the tool and then directly edits the consent document prior to approving the form. Do you think it's time? Should this use of AI by the IRB be permitted? In the room, we have a lot of yeses, but a few no's. How are we doing online?
So online, we have about 60% yes, 8% no, and 30% maybe.
Okay, with conditions.
Yes,
right?
with conditions.
Good IRB folks online, thanks. So if anyone is brave, when we will take a moment for each, I would love a person who said yes and a person who said no, or one that was kind of in the middle. Anyone want to jump in and say yes? Susan.
There you go. It's on.
I think it's really a good start. And we have started to look at that, like for our template language, and taken complex language, put it in 7th grade level, put it in 5th grade level. And it's done a pretty good job. It's not perfect. I would never say that you should just accept it. That is a big caveat.
Yeah.
You really need to go back and look at it. We haven't done that. I haven't thought about doing that with investigative protocols. But certainly for our own template language, I think it's phenomenal, and we're going to be doing that.
Awesome. Anyone who is a hard no wants to say why? And the folks online can also chat their reason for a hard no. I feel like many of the hard no's, there could be some that are more in the with conditions. And I think Susan actually shared the most important condition there, right? Which is, okay, but we don't want to just like create a ridiculous form, right? That we haven't read and we've totally relied on this tool and we haven't taken the time to digest it and say, is this actually something that says the important things? And is there something that we missed? It was actually, when we ran it through the tool, that simplification process actually took out a really important piece of information that we think is critical to participant understanding. So I think this is, and we're going to see a theme here, which is, I think what we really have to think about these as is aids to the IRB, rather than saying, is this the answer to perform either a particular function or role? So this one was pretty positive. Let's see what you think about the next one. An IRB chair is frustrated that the members of the IRB can never seem to come to an agreement on anything. At almost every meeting, there is a split vote on critical issues, and the IRB chair often spends hours just trying to make them decide one way or the other. The chair decides to implement use of a new AI tool to seek the most commonly accepted position on key decision points. In the middle of heated debates, the chair consults with the tool. All members have an opportunity to see the outcome. We have a lot of no's. Some middles. Okay, good. I'm waving around.
Online, it's about 70 to 75 no.
Okay, 70 to 75.
And then about 30% maybe too.
Okay. And we'll start with the maybes. What were your concerns? And that you said, this might be interesting. Anyone in the room that was waving it around as a maybe, or anyone online? Yes.
Hello. Okay. So I wouldn't say yes to this. I would modify it such that if a chair had an AI tool to seek through a database of commonly accepted positions on key decision points and could present that to the board for discussion, which is what we're doing at DFCI, that would be interesting. However, I wouldn't say that the chair should be able to consult the tool and then that takes the day for the outcome, if I'm understanding this correctly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would imagine is a hesitation here is the context in which the tool is used. It's in the middle of the meeting, right? And it's kind of like, okay, I've had enough. You've rambled on, and now we're going to make a decision. And this is a way to help us make the decision. I think it would be, we could imagine the folks who had an opposite position would now feel like, well, am I still allowed to argue that I don't like the most commonly accepted position that has been produced by the AI tool? So I think there's it is a slight nuance, but the idea of presenting, well, I read a little bit about this. I thought this might be a contentious issue. Here's some articles that you can see about how people have handled this in the past. That's a different way to share perspectives than that point, which seems like it's trying to guide the decision. So I agree. I think thinking about the context in which it might be used to understand different perspectives would really help us find the acceptability here. There were some absolutely hard no's. Were those hard no's about the way it was used, or just even the idea of consulting this for a key decision point? Barbara. Barbara.
As a no, because it's not clear to me that that the AI tool is seeking the most commonly accepted position on key decision points. It depends how it's being prompted. So the answer you get is so dependent on how the chair puts that in addition to the maybe issues of when it was introduced and the fact that it, shuts down discussion. So that's, to me,
such a great point. Like, the bias in all of these tools is the way we ask the question, right? So the chair could be sitting in that conversation and asking the question in a way that is going to produce an answer. And that answer could be slanted based on the frustration point at that part of the meeting. It is not necessarily truly representative of what are the key differences and perspectives on this issue. All right, great. Let's look at our next one. This is Julie, did you have something you want to add? Please.
I was just going to say, the other part of it for me, that why I said no here, was not just context, although that was part of it, but the way that it was phrased was just, what's the most commonly accepted position? And I would want to know the rationale for the most commonly accepted position. To me, that would be more meaningful to inform the discussion.
Absolutely. And I love this board. They debate all the time. It's amazing, right? So this is a great board. So I do. And I think that understanding that there likely isn't going to be just an answer here. There's lots of viewpoints that you have to think about the rationale. I think that's a great point. Okay, this is a common challenge. An IRB office is experiencing a reduction in force due to budgeting constraints. Due to the reduction of staff, the IRB director is seeking new tools to help replace work that was traditionally done by IRB staff. She learns of a natural language processing tool that's able to look across submitted text documents and sections of the electronic application to identify discrepancies. For example, the targeted age range for inclusion is listed differently in multiple sections. The tool generates a report of issues identified, and it returns it to the study team to address. The IRB director plans to implement this new tool to replace the IRB staff who previously pre-screened studies prior to IRB review. There are some people who are like, oh my gosh, let me use this right now. Can I have some votes? All right, we have some mix of green and red, and then I love the waving. It's good.
Virtually, it's about a third for each one option. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Each one, yeah.
Any strong feelings? Anyone want to say why they feel yes or maybe? Any comments online? Yes, great. I think
I was a maybe. I think that my sticking point was the fact that the tool generated the list of issues and then returned to the study team to address. I would never be okay with that without a human being going through and verifying what the tool provided for feedback.
Can you imagine the investigator if they got this thing back and they were like, yes, that was a purposeful discrepancy. You were reading the difference between the literature, which was background, and what I plan to do in this study, which is my actual target sample size. So you can imagine if the tool is literally just looking for differences in numbers, you could send this back and create like an incredible frustration. So I agree, there's a part of this that is a human process, but is there something about this idea of this is a really tedious job that sets of eyes do a lot. Is there an idea that something like this could be helpful? I agree. I want something like this. It would even be better if it generated that before it came in, right? I don't even have to give the report. I'm just going to generate it and say, nope, stop right there. I get at least one vote for that. Okay, our next one. As part of its commitment to advancing AI, an institution requires that each department implement an AI tool to improve its operations and enhance the efficiency of the workplace. The tool the IRB has been asked to implement utilizes data from the electronic IRB submission system to create a predictive model to assist with assignment of IRB reviews. Based on protocol features, a recommended reviewer is identified who might be least likely to table the study. In addition to the study characteristics, the tool will evaluate race, gender, and age of IRB members to determine which reviewer should serve as the primary reviewer. The overall goal of the tool is to streamline reviews by reducing the number of studies that are tabled. All right, we've got some waffles. I'm actually interested in the waffles. Okay, we have some hard nose. I expected a lot of red. What about online?
It's about 90% no.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there was a couple. So what is the part that intrigues someone about the possibility? Yes, Kim.
Bite on this. Whoa. I don't like it for race, gender, age. I do like it for a database of expertise and potential expertise with the international population or a vulnerable set of group, population, whether it's the regulatory groups or others, or some other like research methodology. I like it to match that reviewers to those kinds of studies. I don't like it for these other reasons, but I could see it matching expertise and that being really cool.
I also could see matching based on bird, and you did change the case, but that's okay. But I could also see it being potentially useful for the number of assignments that someone had. So that way, so I do think there's this interesting thing to say a predictive algorithm, depending upon how we would structure that, right? We'd want to structure the types of things that it's looking for. But a predictive algorithm that could assist us with review assignments might be very interesting. Okay, all right, our next one. An academic IRB has assumed the role of a single IRB of record for a multi-site study for the first time. There is institutional pressure to demonstrate the ability to onboard sites quickly. The IRB Reliance Manager suggests use of an AI tool that both aggregates state-based legal requirements and performs a web-based retrieval of relevant institutional policies from Reliance sites. Use of the tool will assist the IRB in understanding the applicable legal and institutional policy requirements at each Reliance sites and obviates the need for lengthy processes to collect this information from Reliance sites. I have a lot of yeses. Okay, I have a waffle. Okay, all right, what's and online?
Online, it's about 60% yes, 30% maybe, and 10% no.
We're seeing all of the pain points in IRB folks' lives, right? So yes. So I'm interested in the waffle. Why, Susan?
I would just say that some of this, requires also interpretation. And, as we know, if we look at different states and different policies and different regulations, it needs to be interpreted. So I think this could be useful on some things. I would also say that depending on where they're getting the sites from, sites always don't if they're going on the web. I don't know how many of us have instantaneous changes to our websites and have old information. So I worry about the accuracy of the information. But I do think there is some use, but it's with a lot of caveats.
Great, Barbara.
I would say the same. I would also say that I think this would be ideal to feed back to the local institution and say, this is what we found. Please check and annotate what we've missed.
Yeah. And if there's anything important we need to know about your interpretation of it, please let us know, right? But I do think there's this very interesting thing to say, even if it takes some of the burden down, for the things that are really publicly available or could be accessible. It's an interesting idea. Okay, I know I'm getting short on time. So I'm gonna skip this one and I'm gonna do this one. The IRB staff are frustrated by the lack of discussion at convened IRB meetings, as the meeting discussion is dominated by the chair and one scientific reviewer who frequently shut down questions of others. The meetings occur remotely and most members don't use video. The IRB manager learns that chatbots have been seen as particularly useful in generating discussion in classrooms and can be trained to interject questions into discussions. The IRB manager decides to introduce a chatbot into the IRB meeting by informing IRB members and the chair that a new member has joined the board. The hope is that the presence of the bot will encourage others to speak up. What do you all think? All right, we have a lot of red no's in the room.
We have about 80% no online too.
I wish I could get to the yeses. I really want to know. I want to know what the yeses think.
There's 7% yeses.
Okay, I want to know who those 7% are. So does anyone in the room feel like they would want to, is there a version of this you would find acceptable? Is that, you know, people, we're IRB people, so we're thinking about deception and is this ethical? What if you told people? What if you said, look, we're going to test this out. I'm really worried. You talked to the chair about it. You said, Benji still doesn't like it at all. All right, Benji, tell me why I'm going to pick on you.
You said, what was it? Benji.
I just think it's the wrong solution to the problem. Basically, this is not something that needs a technology solution. Basically, but then I think if you do use the technology solution, I think it's going to have. You're trying to get other people to talk, not get a chatbot to talk. Basically,
one of the things that we have what did you want to share? Yeah, please.
You're asking for examples of why could it have utility.
Okay, bite. You'll be our final thought.
Completely 100% agree that it is the wrong solution to the problem, not a technology thing at all. I could, if I'm trying to think with my imagination hat, I could see a chat bot that everybody knew was there, having being a double check on, are there any questions we should have asked that we didn't?
Interesting.
Like the final discussion, when any last questions, any discussion, the chatbot pipes up, hey, did you ask about this?
Or the person who's like really frantically looking up a regulation in the room, right? Yeah.
Making sure those questions.
Right, that in the heat of the moment and that you might forget those. That's very interesting. So I think Benji really landed on the point that I wanted with this case, which is I do think we really have to think about what problem are we trying to solve, and is an AI solution a helpful tool to solve it? And I think, you know, what Benji said was really spot on. You have a human problem here, actually. It's about the dynamic that you've created in the conversation in the room. And we want to think about that. And there may be specific issues that should be addressed by discussion with the chair or the other IRB members. But the problem that you're trying to solve there is a human problem. So I'm just going to go to one last summary slide because I know we're going to turn it over for questions. So I do think that IRB and IRB operations can benefit. I think we need to think proactively about this. We should be on the forefront of thinking about how this actually can improve efficiency in our work and help us to advance our review processes. But these tools require careful consideration. They have to align with our mission, what our purpose is. They have to be compliant with the regulation. So there was some in there that made me a little nervous that may not have been. And I do think we have to acknowledge the landscape that we're in. This is the time to think about how could you actually introduce some efficiencies that might help create a IRB or HRPP that will address some of the challenges that we're all facing tomorrow and those that may be on the horizon. And then my last plug, especially for this group, is I do think IRBs need guidance to think through this, because otherwise it could be a little bit of a free-for-all, right? There could be some that say, sure, this is fine, and they haven't thought through all the nuances or the complexities, or that you might really still need a human to double check. So I think if we can, as a community, come up with principles and guidelines for how we will incorporate AI into the use of IRB operations in the future, it will really help us from the reviewing side as our research advances in AI as well. All right, thank you all.
Paired.
Wait, one more panel.
And we have one more panel. Susan, you're number 2.
It's not necessarily a question, but another sort of thought, Megan, that is, sometimes, and I wouldn't do this in an open AI area because you're putting on, an investigator's protocol, but I have, myself, thought about if there's something really complex in a protocol that I'm trying to understand, like in background, to put it in there and say, can you simplify and pull it in bullets? And, I've done it, not with our investigators' work. I've just done that. Like I've taken a paper idea that I've read, and it's helped me understand, but you have to be careful. You can't, that's someone's confidential information.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
Hi, this is for Dr. Silverman. There's a lot of different AI tools out there there's more and more every week. I wonder if there's an approach for the IRB in which there's an acceptable set of tools that the researchers use that are easy for us to evaluate as sort of non-technical or non-AI machine learning experts.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think Adam kind of alluded to that too, that the more we can kind of come up with lists of things that have been vetted, right? So this question, I presented kind of what would it look like for us to really vet this? But, my IRB, if I vet it, does your IRB also need to vet it, right? Is there a way for us to share this expertise to say, well, you're using this algorithm in a similar way? The devil, of course, is always in the details, but there's a certain degree to which if one of us does that maybe we can share some of the work, and I think having lists like that would be really helpful.
Just to say that the Catalyst explored this, but it was very hard to get the institutions to agree to rely or to accept the liability that had been determined by other institutions. But that doesn't mean that one institution couldn't offer their review, so long as there was probably a non-disclosure associated with it, because there's also a antitrust issue. So it could be, yeah. Who?
I saw some other question behind that. I have a question.
Who else had a question? Sorry.
Yeah,
okay, you have to go.
Hi, Jackson. Again, sorry. So I did have a question about one thing we're concerned about at DFCI is the proposed rule that will move more research over into the single IRB realm. So we'll have a lot more of that type of research coming through.
So what's the problem?
Well, the problem is the duplicate effort that it's going to create on investigators who have to fill out an application for their single IRB, but then still have to fill out an application internally within their own institution of some kind. So what we're interested, I was just about to get.
Well, give him a chance. Okay, go ahead, Jackson.
In either case. So what's going on is we're interested in using artificial intelligence rather than scripting to take the external IRB applications and map them to our internal institution applications to cut out that extra step that researchers have to do. Previously, you would have had to do that bespoke for each application. Now we can potentially use artificial intelligence. And the point of my question was just to ask if either of you have heard about any initiatives like that.
Yes. So NYU Langone is are prepared to pilot a tool that once you map the data elements from X to Y, it will do it for you. So whether it pilots it, whether we agree to pilot it or not, I'm not sure, because it's a lot of IT work and it may not work. But
the one caveat I would say, so I have seen AI versions of like non-human subject research determination forms, and thinking about, are there things that we can start relying on AI to help us with? The challenge there, of course, is kind of the, garbage in, garbage out problem. And so you're only as good as what you put in, right? And so that is very difficult in our world to kind of live with without a human check. But I think Barbara, to your point, I mean, and I think it's relevant to the question, the challenge that researchers face with single IRB review is the need for the local ancillary reviews, right? And that's why you're submitting to your own hospital. And so to your point, if we can start relying on each other's ancillary reviews a little bit, for example, research information security, again, maybe as at least a starting point, you're still going to do your own. That may be a way to really facilitate and kind of make things more efficient.
Can I just clarify one point on that, is that we're having our informatics team develop a way to grab the information from the external IRB that we're using so that we can have an application that circulates to our internal feasibility people so that we have a way to know about it. So it's just saving the investigator a duplicate effort.
That's great.
My only question for you about that was the willingness of the partners to allow the connection. And I think that would be amazing. And I think the NYU example is great, but the security of the AI connection is what some people worry about, which is saying we're gonna be able to essentially tap into your system to pull the data down and put it into our system, which is the only thing that we've seen people be hesitant about. But I think if we are able to jump the security hurdle, working with colleagues like those that were in the room, that would be a huge time saver. It would be amazing.
We also have colleagues on the virtual that are listening into this.
Good.
Can take notes.
Oh, good. I mean, we're not advertising for any specific solution. We're just advertising that this solution would be terrific. Okay, before we lose energy, the last case. So, you folks that are, who you are, I hope.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Irene. Thank you for being here. You have a few commentators as well. Oh, look at all these people.
Should they have this one as well?
You stay there.
I'll stay here.
And I'll sit here.
And this one you want to talk about the panels. You're fine. Well, either way works with that or that. Oh, no, Martha's going to do this first too, then you're after it.
Okay, so this is a really incredible case study. I'm very excited about this and our awesome panelists. So let me first introduce Dr. Irene Dimitriadis. She is a fellowship-trained reproductive endocrinologist and an infertility specialist at the Mass General Fertility Center. She's also an instructor of OB-GYN and reproductive biology at Harvard Medical School. She participates in the care of women requiring assisted reproductive technologies, including ovulation induction and IVF. She is an active researcher and is interested in understanding how environmental factors can affect the reproductive system. And we're going to hear about one of the other very interesting studies she's doing today. I'll also introduce real quickly our panelists, starting with Alma. Alma Castro is the Assistant Director of Research Administration and Human Subjects Protections at Harvard Business School, and she's also the co-chair of the Harvard Catalyst Social, Behavioral, and Educational Research Subcommittee. Oops. Next is Andrea Collins, who is the Director of IRB Operations at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. She's been working in the IRB operations and human subjects protection world for nearly 17 years. Tanya Ferraro is the Senior IRB QI Consultant for Boston Children's Hospital Education and Quality Improvement Program, and is also co-chair for Primer's 2023 CBER Conference Planning Committee, and serves on the Education Committee, which will be important when we get to some of our questions, I think. And then Kim Serpico on the end is the Associate Director of IRB Operations for the Harvard School of Public Health Medical School and the Harvard School of Dental Medicine. She serves as the co-chair of the Harvard Catalyst Emerging Technologies, so right in your bailiwick here, Ethics and Research Committee, and co-authored the CITY program training module on the risks of novel technologies in human research. So I'm looking forward to Kim having all the answers for us after we start here. So I will turn things over to Irene to start the case.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be able to present this in front of the specific group. Just a disclosure, this has not been yet approved by our IRB, so I wanted to just let everybody know that it's in the process. And I think part of the reason that we were asked to be here was basically some of the obstacles that we're needing to address. So as you heard, I'm Irene Dimitriadis. I'm an OBGYN by trade and an infertility specialist at Mass General Hospital. And I titled the presentation basically what our RCT is. It's the asset trial, and we're trying to use artificial intelligence in embryo selection for single embryo transfer. So I was actually asked to really briefly, I'm not sure how briefly I can do this, but really briefly go through a little bit of a reminder of reproductive biology and IVF before I tell you a little bit about the project itself. Really, really briefly, as we all know, an egg and a sperm need to actually meet in order to create an embryo. It needs to travel through a tube. It needs to get into the uterus. It needs to implant. And if it has a correct genetic makeup, it will ultimately give us the live birth that we're all looking for. There's a lot of ifs in that process. So not every egg is meant to become an embryo, and not every embryo is meant to become a baby. So just basic knowledge about the reproductive system for the humans. We're very inefficient as a species. I know we spend a lot of time trying not to get pregnant, but we only have about a 20% chance of pregnancy each month that a female will drop an egg, and that's if a female will drop an egg. So there are other diagnoses. So what do we do? What does an infertility specialist do? Have we figured out a way to improve that process? Really, what we've done is we've only figured out a way to make it a little bit more efficient. So instead of dropping the single egg that a female is going to drop, whether you're 20 or 30 or 40, the way that we've made the process a little bit more efficient is basically by stimulating the ovary and trying to make the cohort of eggs that is there anyway each month to all grow together and simultaneously. And whether we're doing conservative methods like intrauterine inseminations, or whether we're doing a little bit more aggressive methods like IVF, which I will be focusing on today, basically we're trying to increase that denominator of eggs to potentially increase the denominator of embryos that we're able to make, and find that golden embryo that has the correct genetic makeup that will give us the live birth, right? And in that cohort, there might be one, there might be none, there might be more than one. Really brief overview of what happens when somebody walks into the door and basically is destined to go through IVF. A lot of steps. They meet us, we do some workup, a lot of blood work, a lot of ultrasounds, a lot of procedures that need to be done. We ultimately decide, yes, my friend, your IVF is the way to go for you. We have to stimulate these ovaries with a bunch of medications. I'm sure you've all probably seen either on media or TikTok or wherever. And basically at some point, we are able to stimulate that ovary so that we can try to grab those eggs with an egg retrieval, which is the procedure where we take the eggs from the follicles and then we try to fertilize them. And this is actually the most important part of IVF. It's basically in the title, in vitro fertilization, right? So this is the most important part of IVF, the embryology lab. We do everything in the embryology lab. We have to create the embryos, and then we have to transfer them afterwards. That's the embryo transfer. Finally, 2 weeks later, we get the pregnancy test, and if it's positive, we all celebrate. Majority of times, unfortunately, again, because we're very inefficient as a species, it's probably going to be negative. But if it's positive, we all celebrate. So just to focus on that fertilization component, right? That small little circle in all of this is actually what happens in the lab. It's really, really complex. So from the retrieval to the transfer, right? We basically have to grab the eggs, bring the eggs and the sperm together, create an embryo, see if there's proper fertilization. Hopefully there's good fertilization rates, enough to continue to make an embryo. Not all embryos are destined to grow. Once the embryos continue to grow, we still watch them to see if they have good grading or good quality embryos, and I'll get to that in just a second. And then we can do these extra little steps like biopsying them to see if they have the correct genetic makeup or not. Another big discussion, or if they have mutations, or can we freeze them for future use and so on. So just that little circle in the IVF process is all of this. And this all happens in the lab. Again, most important part of IVF. So now I'm going to start getting into the AI component. So basically, we're hoping that AI will help us become a little bit more precise in the IVF process. How? Well, the first thing we need to all kind of remind ourselves is that embryo selection is not a perfect science, at least not currently. It's actually kind of a flip of a coin. But so basically, we're trying to look at this cohort of embryos that we've been able to create in the IVF lab, and we're trying to find the best quality embryo. Does that mean it looks good? Does that mean it should give me the baby? It should be. It's going to give me the baby. But what we can see and what we can evaluate as humans is basically, does it look good? And it's a beauty pageant. So if anybody can tell me which one looks the best, that's kind of what happens in the embryology lab. They all look the same practically. Anyway, so we have very highly specialized people called embryologists that are able to grade these embryos. They actually give them a grade. Are we grading them correctly? That was one of the most important questions that we have in our field. And the way that they're graded, and I'm going to focus on, I'm sorry for the back and forth, but I'm actually going to focus on that part that says the blastocyst assessment. So that is the day 5 embryo, at which time a human embryo has split into 2 different cell populations, one that's going to become the placenta and one that's going to become the fetus. So that's called the trophectoderm and the inner cell mass. And we give this embryo a grade. Is it nice and big? Is it really small still? So is it an early blastocyst? So that goes from 1 to 6. Then we look at it, we grade the inner cell mass. That's what's going to become the fetus. Is it A, B, C, or D? The trophectoderm, which is going to become the placenta, is it A, B, C, or D? And then we make decisions based off of that, which is the most important part of this. So this graph is just, and you don't have to necessarily know the entire context of this study, but basically there's a lot of subjectivity in a human looking at an embryo and giving it a grade, right? If it's close to 1 or 2, should I pick 1 or 2? If it's close to A or B, maybe B, right? And we make decisions off of that grading. The decisions that we make are actually very, very important in IVF. Do we transfer that embryo? Do we transfer it first compared to another embryo? Do we biopsy the embryo? We can't biopsy all embryos, so not a lot of people know that. So when we're making a decision about whether or not a embryo can be frozen for future use or for biopsy purposes for the genetic makeup, or should we continue to culture it out, we go based off of the grading. And each facility may have a little bit of a different type of grading. A majority uses approximately the same kind of grading, but basically there's a lot of variability in that happening. So why did we want to try to bring artificial intelligence, machine learning, and specifically CNNs into the IVF lab? Because the hope was not to replace the embryologist, but to aid the embryologist when they're in that little pickle of, is it a B or C? And to keep a little bit more consistency with embryo grading, embryo selection, of which would have the highest potential of implanting and giving us the baby. And we do have some background studies that we've been able to complete through our facility with the help of Dr. Borman and Dr. Shafi's lab from the Brigham. Dr. Borman is actually our IVF lab director at Mass General and is a pioneer in this area. So basically, some of the studies that we've been able to complete, which are retrospective studies, have shown that the artificial intelligence, machine learning has been able to assist and maybe even surpass what the embryologists have been choosing for embryo implantation and ultimately success rates. So for this specific one, for example, the algorithm that was developed was actually demonstrated about a 75% implantation. It was able to identify 75% of the times compared to 67% of the times, which was the embryologist assessment. And you're gonna see this kind of come up, the morphological assessment. That's what we call the standard of care for grading and choosing an embryo in IVF currently. And then there was another study that came out very, not recently anymore, but a couple years ago, where we once again took a look to see, could AI assist the embryologist, not just the consistency component, but also could it perhaps make their decision-making a little bit more accurate? And it actually ended up showing an improvement of about 11%. And it didn't matter if this was an experienced embryologist or somebody who was just starting off. So definitely seems to have some background here. We have some support from these retrospective studies showing this benefit. And the biggest challenge in IVF right now, and has always been, that as of right now, we still transfer way too many embryos in a single patient. And what we're trying to do is, for each and every patient, we want to maximize the probability of a single take-home baby with minimizing the possibility of a multiple gestation, right? We hear about the twins and the octomoms and so on. The whole concept here is to try to be able to identify which embryo should I be selecting and would give me that very precious live birth. So the next big thing, obviously, after all these retrospective studies that we were able to kind of have a little bit of proof of concept here, was an RCT. And this is where this comes in. So we're hoping to and aspiring to be able to launch this at Mass General Hospital. It's called the ASSET trial, as I said at the beginning of the presentation. And basically, we're trying to identify and select a high quality embryo for transfer, which is the key component of improving pregnancy rates, obviously. Morphology at this point, which is the standard of care, gold standard of care, cannot guarantee whether or not an embryo is going to actually give you a baby. What it can do thus far, and it again kind of depends on the clinic, but what it can do thus far is potentially help us identify which ones are strong enough to survive certain hits like freezes and thaws and biopsies, but it doesn't tell us whether or not it's going to give us the live birth. The hope is that we're going to use a CNN and it'll be able to assist us basically. The CNN that we have developed at Mass General is called Exception Architecture, and it was actually pre-trained with almost 1.5 million ImageNet images, and then transfer learned with over 2,400 day 5 human embryos. So again, I'm concentrating on day 5, and the reason that I'm concentrating on day 5 is the blastocyst embryos. Those are the only ones that can be frozen or that we traditionally freeze in our clinic. The design is supposed to be a prospective, double-blinded, 2-arm randomized controlled trial. It's aimed at assessing and comparing an image-based artificial intelligence system that was actually developed in-house, and disclosure, it is patented by Fujifilm at this point, to highly trained embryologists in selecting embryos for frozen embryo transfer. This would be a single embryo transfer, so we would be selecting one embryo at a time at a single center, and we do understand the biases behind this, but at our center. And the Subjects would be basically randomized into the 2 arms that you see right here. It's a schema. Okay. So the aim would be to determine the clinical impact of integrating image-based AI systems into routine frozen embryo transfer protocols. The big question for everybody is, what would this cost the patient that actually ends up enrolling for this study? The fact that we're focusing on frozen embryo transfers is kind of key here. The reason is this is a non-inferiority design, and the hope is that it'll minimize any patient risks and it'll maximize pregnancy outcomes. Why? Because anything that's frozen is basically already a high quality, or what we call a high quality blastocyst stage embryo. So they all have the potential of being transferred, and they all have the potential of becoming a baby. The question will be, in which order do we transfer them? So there's actually, if you think about it, no true risk of, for example, right, discarding an embryo, because that's what the AI told us, and that would have given us the baby. This is specifically for frozen embryo transfers. So at most, we are changing the order of transfer with really no impact on reducing available embryos for transfer, and there's really no increased risk to the patient. We're not changing anything in their protocol, the way that they're stimulated, the way that we prepare the uterus, the medications that they're taking, the procedure that they need to undergo. Nothing is actually changing. It's just the order of which we choose which embryo will be transferred. And what will the patient have to gain if this ends up showing non-inferiority, and we're pretty confident it actually end up potentially showing benefit to our patients? It will increase the efficiency of a single embryo transfer, which is basically the big question that we're all asking in IVF, right? Just get that one embryo in that can actually give us that live birth. And if you think about it, it's actually super beneficial to the patients, especially an infertility patient who's suffered a lot. If you think about it, not just physically, but psychologically as well, the sooner you get to the live birth, the better it is for the patient psychologically. And even though this doesn't necessarily apply to Massachusetts because we're a mandated state, so a lot of infertility coverage, if they have private insurance, is covered. But for other states, it could be a financial benefit. Instead of going through embryo transfer after embryo transfer after embryo transfer to finally get to the live birth, if we're able to move that live birth up in the order, then that's also financially beneficial to the patient. And then, of course, there is a broader benefit for use of artificial intelligence, especially as far as improved access is concerned. Again, we're spoiled. We live in Massachusetts. In Boston, there's like 3 laboratories just in Boston. And then there is the Midwest, where basically you need to travel miles and miles away to get to an IVF clinic, and this could potentially help. So we're hoping that this will be an aid for the embryologists. What has been our major obstacle, and why am I here? I'm here because of IRB approval, it looks like. But we're getting to where we need to get. We've gotten some some questions answered. But I think the hardest part for us has been the FDA regulation component. Is this an IDE or not? And although I would have loved for the FDA to kind of apply that cartoon, that caricature, I understand why they're not and they can't. So we're kind of stuck in the first cartoon there, where we're not sure, kind of lost in paperwork to try to get this, the FDA regulation component done. And that's, I tried to keep it brief. I'm sorry, Evan, if I went over, but like I tried to keep it as brief as possible. Okay, this is our team. So I think we're at questions. Is that right? Okay. Do you want me to? Do I sit? Okay.
Okay, thanks so much, Irene. That was great. Really appreciate it. So I think I'm going to ask our panelists. They've been great in thinking through some questions for me, but we've talked about a lot of things today, and we really want to focus on kind of the IRB thought process here and some of the issues around that, how we would think about this study. There's potentially some big ethical issues here, but I wanted to start really with Tanya, because I think you brought up some interesting issues, but one of the things that I really want to talk about is around how, interacting with the potential participant here. And I'm going to ask you first, and then I might ask Irene to comment as well. What do you think is going to be important, setting aside the consent document itself, but what's important here from your perspective to share with the potential participants from an IRB perspective?
Oh, okay. So, I think the thing about, and I'm going to put a disclaimer on my response to start with. So, we've heard a lot about AI, and in the very beginning, Dr. Mandel had quoted, Elon Musk and Sam Altman about the existential threat, essentially, of AI itself. But Sam Altman has also said that AI is going to be as common of a use as a calculator. That's where it's going. And so when I hear that, I also hear that it's transformative. And so for us in the IRB, we know our world, right? Like we know what we know about our world, and we hopefully admit what we don't know about the research that's presented in front of us. So I look at this as an opportunity for participants, for the IRBs, to ask questions as these things are changing and keeping a pulse on what is occurring. So that's kind of what.
Yeah, any particular, educational tools you think we could use here?
Hello. Okay. It's the end of the day. We're doing our best. No, I think, I think we can rethink educational tools. So maybe the informed consent can be part of an educational tool, like something built into the consent saying, when you're talking about explainability, like maybe that's part of the tool of saying, we don't know this. So maybe we will check in with you to see what you understand about this. Teach back method for consenting is a process that we're aware of, but like maybe really engaging with that and having the QI with that to say like, these can be educational pieces and kind of lower hanging fruit rather than taking on like, we're going to teach you everything about AI and generative AI versus analytical AI and all of the issues that come with it, So really taking those pieces of the participant experience and using them in an organic way to educate ourselves and educate, future possible participants.
Great, thanks. And Irene, maybe before I go to you, I'm going to ask Kim to weigh in, because Kim, you had some thoughts around this too. I thought some unique points around kind of timing, and we're very interested in making sure that our participants are making choices that are voluntary. That could be a little bit confounded with their need and their want to go through this procedure. So how have you thought about the timing of consent and perhaps, multiple conversations, that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that when we first consulted with Irene about this case, it's such a great case, I love it, is of course, we all know that the voluntary nature of participation is so paramount, essential. And I wonder, it seems as if there's a point of no return, right? Where voluntariness may functionally end when you have said, okay, this participant agreed to participate in this trial. They're totally on board with AI selecting the embryo. We're going to do it one at a time. They understand all the methods. And then you implant the embryo. Does that function? My question for you, kind of querying Irene as the expert, but also my own thoughts about it are, if that functionally ends, what are the implications for, all of our ethical principles, respect for persons, do no harm, justice even, is like, is this the right person to select? are there other reasons why we would want multiple time points throughout the life of this study to consent the participant? But what if that embryonic transplant and implantation is the barrier and then it stops? Like that, I guess that's my question too for you, Irene, is there a time point where there is no turning back? Because for the IRB, I think for us, we would say this delicate a matter, with this delicate a population, continual ongoing life cycle consent is probably the way to go, not just a one and done, especially since you showed us all these different graphs, like clinically and also just in the lab, is like, this is what's happening to your biological materials. There's so many inflection points where that could be addressed with the participant. As an IRB person, I'm looking at that going, there's a lot of opportunity for lots of ongoing consent here, except for when you implant and then you hope for the baby. Yeah, I'm just thinking about it in terms of that.
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's basically, what if the patient is like, thinks about it and basically is like, yeah, I said, okay, but now I don't want the AI to be part of this. Can I go back in my slides or no? Okay. So actually, there's multiple time points where we would be checking in with the patient, and the way that the entire process goes for an embryo transfer, you basically would consent the patient at the beginning, right? When she's coming to the office, or when the couple's coming to the office, and basically saying, listen, you know, there are certain inclusion criteria, obviously, and I didn't go through everything. This is a very special population of infertility patients. This is actually the high prognosis group, which actually has multiple high quality embryos that they could potentially transfer. And I hopefully tried to make it a little bit clear, but the gold standard of how we choose right now is actually a little bit better maybe than a flip of a coin when we're choosing between these graded embryos. So they would get the opportunity, of course, to see if they qualify for the study. They would go through the consent form. We would explain to them, of course, what the risks, what the benefits would be. And then they actually come in multiple times because they do their baseline ultrasound and then they do their final lining checks. And we see, you should come to Yaki 10 one day. We see these patients so frequently. At any part of this process, they can stop. They can and it won't change their standard of care in any way, because what we're doing, the only part that the machine learning will be implemented will be literally the day of to be fair, the day prior we'll already have made the decision, but the day prior to the embryo transfer, which embryo will be thought in the morning. And if the patient calls that night, the night before, because we thought the day of the transfer, they could still back out of it. Once you do the transfer, obviously you're not going to back out of it, right? You can't. I think there's an endpoint for any study in that situation. That would be the case though for a standard embryo transfer as well, because you could argue, well, what if this patient actually said, well, I know how embryo grading is happening right now in the gold standard. I don't want that embryo. I actually want another embryo, which we have. We have patients that might opt or request that another embryo that is not the highest graded, which is not the gold standard of care, to be transferred before for multiple reasons. But there are those situations where even now they could say, I actually don't want the standard of care. And this is the same kind of concept. So I think hopefully that puts you a little bit to ease as far as like how up until the day of, technically they could back out of this and it could go back and revert to standard of care. The embryologist looks at it and goes by the graded. And to be honest with you, there's nothing extra that the embryologist has to do. The reason is because these are frozen, we were really, really specific in the type of embryos that we're, or like the type of trial that we're doing. Because again, we know how sensitive this field is. We're trying to do this right? And do this with a randomized controlled trial before we actually start implementing this. But the frozen embryo transfers are the key here, because they've already been graded. The embryologist doesn't even have to go back. They basically will look at their sheet and say, okay, fine, you don't want the one that the AI selected, which probably might be the same one anyway, but you don't want the one that the AI selected. I'm gonna go back to our standard of care. Here's our sheet. It was the 3BB that we were gonna transfer today. That's the one you're getting. So hopefully that puts a little bit of the consenting or backing out and patient autonomy to ease a little bit.
Yeah, and just the responsibility of the researchers to say, actually, there is a lot of these time points. And just back to your education question, Martha, I think that this, I told Irene as she was presenting us this case that like, if like you need to come explain this process to anyone on my IRB, because I think it's so comprehensive that there's no way that even a one-off brand new randomized controlled trial like this involving AI, that any of my members have that extreme sliver of expertise. And so I think going back to the education part is like engaging somebody like you, Irene, to say, come and educate. You are the right person to educate the IRB about this issue and how all of these pieces fit like a puzzle, because you didn't hesitate. You had an immediate answer to my question of what about all the time points, you know, and I wouldn't have known that. And I think that is an extremely valuable part of the education, is having the right person educate the IRB too.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Kind of along those lines, you know, the job of the IRB obviously involves consent and recruitment, but wanted to kind of turn to Andrea, because I think, you know, one of your questions revolved around some of the things we've heard from Benji and others today about what should the IRB be asking about with AI research, and maybe particularly to this case, but also in general, what do you think would be appropriate paths for the IRB to take here in their scope?
Right. So definitely in this case, we'd want very specific information about the software itself. Of course, we need to understand how it's being used, what data is being collected, where that data is being shared, with whom the data is being shared, what are the risks of that data sharing. You know, a lot of times there are sponsors of studies or maybe very small companies that don't necessarily have device brochures or a specific pamphlet to provide the IRB. And in those cases, we definitely still want information about the device, the AI itself. Because, you know, the IRB is certainly not an expert. So we definitely need that information. If there is a sponsor, then we also want to know how the sponsor is viewing the AI. Do they view it as a device? And if so, then the IRB certainly should review it as a device. So there's certainly a lot of questions, but those are just some of the questions that we've started to ask when we receive submissions.
Great, thanks. And I think, you know, the other thing that ties into some of the talks we had earlier, and Alma, this gets at one of your questions, I think, in interest here, is around this idea of what should the IRB be asking for with regards to show confidence that the model's been trained accurately, but more specifically to this study. I think, Irene, you said you did use varied data in the training process, or your embryologist did, I think was the thing. But what if her application had been submitted to you or to your IRB, Alma, and they only use data within their own institution? Would the IRB have concerns about that, or would you call on outside expertise? How would you handle that?
I think for our IRB, actually for the IRB that I used to be in, I should say, I think the board would have brought questions similar to that up, talking about how the AI was trained, and having a good explanation of that. If the board felt in any way that they needed that expertise, I think they would seek it out. And I think in fairness, the IRB that I used to be in was Kim, and Kim did a really good job of finding outside expertise for questions that the board might have, anticipating what those questions might be, and getting that assessment ahead of time. And I think going back to what Julie said this morning about shared responsibility, I think it would be asking the PI give us more information about how you've trained this model, and then putting some of the responsibility back on the board to be asking those right questions and to be getting those outside experts to come in and help and evaluate the product that the PI has been submitting in their application.
So maybe, I'm sorry, Irene, did you want to? Okay. Okay.
I was just gonna, for this specific, if we're kind of focusing on this specific RCT, this is an internal trained artificial intelligence, machine learning, CNN. However, we have actually done some outside studies outside of our facility to see how it would do. These are all retrospective studies. So coming into this, we wanted to come into this without any danger to our patients. You can imagine, right? Embryologists want to keep their success rates up. That's how an infertility clinic basically advertises itself, by its success rate. So that's not something that we would want to implement if it's going to decrease the success rates. And on top of it, you can imagine if I was going to try to recruit patients of mine, I would want them to 100% have some sort of benefit from this possibly. And you can imagine my colleagues, the other like 6 or 7 physicians I work with, they wouldn't be wanting to recruit their patients if there's not this data. So I think we do try to have some sort of background studies in order to validate it before actually trying to implement it. And one thing, I don't know if this is the right time to say this or not, but one thing about the fertility world, we live in a subspecialty where because there's so many unknowns in our field, we implement or we use certain tools that are not necessarily evidence-based. And whoever has gone through infertility or has come through an infertility clinic may know that from their own experiences, where a lot of things that we do are not evidence-based. And understanding the sensitivity of this specific population, being in it, and also understanding the complexity of how people will perceive even the word artificial intelligence. We're trying to do this right. We're actually trying to do the RCT before it gets implemented into the clinic, which I'm sure there might be other places that are going to try to use it without the RCT. But that is the reality of the world that I kind of, practice in. So a little bit maybe different than other subspecialties, but a lot of things that we do might not be evidence-based.
Great, thanks. And you set up kind of my last question, because I think we're going to move into questions from the audience and online, but and not to give you guys an unfair question here that you're not prepared for, but I'm just curious. I know when I first saw this study, I was like, an RCT, really? Is that the right thing here to do here? So again, from the IRB perspective, give me your thoughts on whether this is the right study design, or you'd like to see something else, or questions you think your IRB might have about that. Tanya, it looks like you're jumping at the microphone.
I just got really excited because I love RCTs. I was trained in as a project manager in RCTs and interventional health. And one of the reasons why I love RCTs, and I'm a pluralist when it comes to methodology, so I also love other methods, but I love that RCTs, if you're in a space that hasn't had empirical research evidence done, it's a way to get there. And and also going back to education, it can be an opportunity to educate what the realities are in context of that space is. Because I've seen this in different IRB spaces, that a study comes up, and when there isn't something evidence-based historically in that field, like in some of our spaces, it's just part of the it's just in the DNA of the field. But in other spaces, like education, even social behavioral spaces, when you're not seeing that frequency, you kind of have that like, ooh, you want to do what, where, you know? But then when you really look at it and you hear like, we don't have evidence-based information on this. So right now it's pretty much, you know, we're doing our best, you know, it's up to chance, it's up to fate, it's up to the person that's making that decision. That's why I get excited about it.
Yeah, and I think it's challenging in the AI space right now, especially to be creative in the design, to be able to do an RCT. I haven't seen a lot of these, I think, with the new technology, but interested in other comments on that.
Yeah, I think it's great that you're doing the RCT first. I think, you know, we are getting, you know, a lot of people are submitting to us after they've already done a project, right? And they didn't do it in a very well organized way. They certainly didn't do a randomized clinical trial, right? And so they're coming to us to say, well, now we want to publish. We found this. We did this as a QI project. We did this clinically. We've already implemented it, but they want to publish it now. And they're realizing that, of course, there's a lot of information that they can share. And so I think that for you to do this first, I think is really the right way to do it. And I think a lot of our other investigators haven't really thought that through, and they're doing their other work first, right?
I'm going to agree with the panel. I think you've done, it seems based off of the information I've heard, that you've done the testing of the model. You've done all you can with like secondary retrospective data. So the next point is to implement something. And so I do believe that our IRB would be amenable to that. Absolutely.
I just had a couple of comments that the other powerful thing about potentially doing an RCT and knowing your population so well, Irene, is you know your patients know the vernacular here. This isn't something that is brand new to them. It might be brand new to an IRB, AI, IVF, all of these procedures that you just talked about. And so I think that, you know, kind of one of the hot topics, but I hope it's less a hot topic and more a permanent thing to stay, of course, is community engagement, where you have this extremely robust, very health literate group of patients who are willing and ready to do this. And the way that you've explained it is like, I feel like the way that you've explained these procedures is almost RCT adjacent, in that you're flipping a coin anyway. When you're saying that there's a possibility of a baby or not, you get into the math of the probability. That is not my area. But the other thing that you said that was really interesting, that kind of relates to community perspectives that might go to the individual benefit of the individual. Yes, they have a baby, great. There seems like there might be a lot of social value here too, where you're talking about empirically validating tools, where people are going to clinics expecting something. You talked about financial benefit that might wash out how much people are spending on IVF. So I think that it's really incumbent on IRBs to look at all of these different dimensions. What are the community perspectives? What's the individual benefit? What's the social benefit, social value of all of these things, outweighed against the risks, which again, we might not know as non-experts, but can rely on you to say, this is all the empirical data we have. Now we have to move forward. Like Tanya said, and RCT seems like the most beneficial way to get about that.
So I think we'll turn it over to the audience now, and if there's anyone online.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. So one thing I wanted to ask that's factual is, this is done with frozen embryos. Is the eventual vision to do it with fresh embryos? And what's the transition plan to get there? Shortly, briefly, because I've got a whole list of questions. I want to get this going.
Because I can talk about this forever, clearly.
Yeah, clearly, but
clearly.
Just pause, take a breath, and you know.
Okay, let me try that. The short answer to that question would be, the hope is that this is a stepping stone.
No, I got that.
To build trust, so that when there is data for the fresh embryo transfers, there won't be that fear that we might be doing something detrimental to the patient. So yes, ultimately,
that may end up being the goal. You're going to be able to make that leap, frankly, because you've already selected the embryos manually, right? So, that are getting frozen. You've rejected ones that you're not. So at a minimum, if you show non-inferiority, you're going to have to do that piece, throw it out. You can test it, but you can't allow all of them to be possible.
So they do get a grade though on day 5. So what is that what you're saying? Like, so even manually, a fresh transfer, yes. So not all patients are fortunate enough to have frozen embryos.
Okay,
so
that can take this offline.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, they may also be fortunate enough to have used their one and been pregnant. So
correct.
So so that's the first thing. So then, you know, there's a huge bias, of course, because you've already chosen ones that you would think are equivalent. So the risk is really pretty, quote, small that you're going to choose one that you wouldn't have implanted. But I would say one other thing that I would introduce, just thinking about it, is having whoever would be choosing amongst those 5 that are frozen choose anyway, so that you can compare and put it in the bank. You don't even have to just have them put it in an envelope. I would have chosen 3, just so you can compare whether you're going to see something.
We have done that though, those studies and some other studies, that has been done. Basically, we've been able to retrospectively, it's kind of like a simulation.
I'm not talking about retrospective. I'm talking about, you got 5 embryos, right? You're going to, you know, with woman A, you're going to choose. With woman B, randomized, you're going to have AI choose. I would have in the AI, the same person or people choose, put it in an envelope, put it away.
And see if they would choose the same one as what you're
so
saying.
You can tell. The third thing I would say is, I think the statistics here are really complicated because you're taking a population that have not been pregnant before. You're looking for non-inferiority that haven't had a successful pregnancy, right? And you're looking for non-inferiority and they're already failed once. So you're going to have, so what's the statistical likelihood? How many patients
failed ones?
Well, they got frozen.
Not everybody has a fresh transfer.
Oh, I see.
This is, yeah. So that's why I said not, there's some complexities in the
So then you have to separate those that have had a failed versus a not.
Which are in the inclusion criteria, yes.
Which way is it an inclusion?
So typically, the high prognosis patients would be the ones that actually have 2 or more frozen embryos in the bank. And in this case, we're not necessarily taking out the patients that have not been pregnant. So there are infertility patients that come as secondary infertility. There are
I mean the ones that had a fresh transfer that didn't take. And now they're back to you for number 2.
For frozen embryo transfer. Yeah, those are in there. But you mean stratifying them?
Yes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So that will be in the plan.
So you got it even worse. It's two arms, one that had, and one that didn't. And now you're going to do a non-inferiority.
But what's the question is,
how many
the goal, right?
What?
So the question that it's a matter of what the question is for statistics, right?
Non-inferiority, right?
But for whether or not we're going to have the pregnancy outcome that we want.
Correct.
So it's not relying on the previous transfers. Does that make sense? So this is a population of patients that have frozen embryos that are high quality, 2 or more.
Yeah.
Because you have to have 2 or more, right? Yes. Clearly. The question will be compared to the embryo that was selected by your embryologist. So that's your time point right there.
Yes, I understand this.
Compared to the time point that your embryologist is choosing, right? So 3BB, I would choose this one versus this one, right? According to the grading. And they go down the line, right? The 4AB goes first.
Yeah,
okay.
I get this.
So based off of that grading versus what the AI is asking to choose or telling you to choose.
Right.
So then it's a matter of what is the outcome. the outcome is a positive clinical pregnancy test or not, correct?
It can either be, you know, a live birth or a pregnancy test. I don't care which it is.
Okay.
You got one outcome, a primary outcome.
But maybe I'm not understanding what your question is as far as the bias is concerned, or like the statistical component.
Well, maybe if I've lost everybody, I can come back. We can do it over wine.
Right. I don't know we're going to get the answer with wine, but yeah.
It's absolutely critically important but whatever, we'll take it offline. Okay. So quickest question, is this FDA regulated? You're not allowed to answer. Tanya.
Am I supposed to just say yes, no answer?
Yes or no? Do you want here, everybody, okay? Is this FDA regulated?
I'm pretty sure Megan said I could waive.
Yes. No, you can't waive. Can't waive. What do you say?
I think we're gonna start with a yes.
No question. Okay. Go for it. Other questions?
However,
yeah, go for it.
Well, yeah. Yes to your last question, but I'm wondering if what you were saying is just you're going to need a lot of patients to see the difference. I think that's what the question was: is how many patients are you planning to enroll?
Oh yeah, and we've done the initial like statistics for this. This is part of the protocol. I think it's like 200 for each arm. So it'll be 200 and 200 for a total of around 200. I don't recall the exact number.
That was the question.
Right.
So absolutely, there's plenty of, but our clinic alone does over 1,500 cycles and 700 FETs. So there's definitely, yeah, it's not going to be done in 6 months. If that's the question, no, it's a long-term RCT. That's why we're doing all of this, right? So it'll take about a year or 2 to recruit and get this done. But we do have the embryo numbers. Number.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry. I totally misunderstood. You were asking me then. So absolutely. We've done the background statistics to see that this is properly done statistically with a non-inferiority trial to see, this would be a non-inferiority trial to see, do we have the numbers? Is this feasible in just our clinic? And it is. So that's why we submitted it because it seems to be with our numbers.
Hi, Irene. We've talked on the phone. I'm Benji Silverman. We haven't met
nice
face
to
to
meet
face,
you in person.
so you know who it is talking.
Yeah.
I had a question, and maybe I've read this protocol before. The question that came up around this has been internally validated, right? And you're using it internal to your clinic.
Right.
I'm wondering that question about kind of what your intent is longer term. Is there a hope or plan to commercialize, or is this really intended to be planned to be used in your clinic with the backdrop of, I know exactly what you're talking about, which is that the IVF world is highly commercialized with non-evidence-based treatments?
So that's a great question, which I'm probably not the one that's going to answer that, because I'm the clinician that's trying to help the patients and the pregnancy outcomes here. My intent is not to commercialize any, I have no gain in this financially. So the question is this something that may end up being implemented in each fertility clinic? There are fertility clinics that are going to commercialize. I think there is one out there already, like VitroLife, which is FDA approved. It's a little bit of a different AI model, but they've actually have, I think in 2019. So if you go through the FDA machine AI approved devices, it's in there. So I do think, based off of how I see the industry moving, that yes, there will be this inclination to definitely commercialize. It's not going to come from us. That I can tell you now. It's not going to come internally from the MGH physicians. We're doing this to see if this would work for our patients, if it would benefit our patients. You're right, it's been internally validated. These embryos that this specific CNN was trained on are specific to our institution. We did apply it to an outside fertility clinic to see again, retrospectively, but to see if we could get a better kind of percentage of implantation rates through the AI that we've built. And it seems to actually work even for different populations, but like a different fertility population. But the intent right now, and part of the question for bias, right? Because that's a bias. If we're using our own patient population, that's a bias. However, I think it's actually going to work to the benefit for the RCT because this is our population that we're applying it on. So if you think about it that way, it's actually better that it hasn't been, we're not taking outside sources because this is our specific population. Now, to be fair, we're part of a group that is hoping to actually start regulating it in our world as well. So the SART data is where it's like kind of a governing service, right? Where we have to report to them what our success rates are. And per IVF cycle, per fresh cycle, twin pregnancies, multiple pregnancies, right? And we actually in our, so Dr. Borman was president of SART recently. He actually is gonna try to track this nationally. So whoever is, because I can tell you, there are gonna be clinics and our clinics that are using it. It doesn't mean that it's IRB approved. It doesn't mean that it's been validated, but hopefully in their institution it has been. But there are clinics that are using it and will commercialize it, meaning advertise it at least, at minimum, that they're using this to improve pregnancy rates. Does that answer the question? But there's no intention from the group to commercialize this. This is purely scientific for us.
It's been a long day, and I'm getting the cue to move things along. We thank you all very much.
Like I said, I could talk about this all day, right?
So I promise, we don't need that slide up. I promise I'll be very, very fast. I know it's been a long day for everybody, and we thank you for being here. We've enjoyed putting this together, and we hope that you enjoyed being here as much as we have. As Barbara mentioned in the beginning, this idea came from a small group getting together and just looking for someone to come to a meeting and tell them more about AI, and it really snowballed into what we have today. We had about 500 registrants, both including internal in the room here, as well as virtually. And from what we heard today, I think we can all agree that there's continued education and learning that we all need. This is an ever-changing field. Learning to prompting a language model and alignment. What we hope that you've clarified today, and I know that there's still a lot of questions and still a lot of work that needs to be done, are in this fast-changing topic area. I'm just going to read through some bullets that I put together that you've learned, things related to ethical considerations and bias using AI. FDA regulation considerations, identifying complexities using AI, including data access, security, privacy, and sharing, facilitating the adoption of evaluation of AI and partnering with clinicians, researchers, and informatics to inform regulatory guidance and alignment. Identifying a process required for IRB and HRPP professionals when reviewing study, utilizing AI and the criteria for approval. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that we don't always feel like that sad little puppy that has to listen to the old exhausting Shakespeare lecture us in a poetic way. I really want to thank everybody that was online today and in the room today. I know it takes a lot of time to come in person these days. I want to thank all the speakers and panelists for putting all the time in and showing up in person today. I want to thank the planning committee for spending months and months on end on these bi-weekly meetings every Monday morning at 8 o'clock to go through everything. I want to thank the Harvard Catalyst regulatory team for staffing the meeting, and especially thank Evan for putting everything together over the past 6 to 8 months. Keeping us in line, herding the cats, getting all the slides together, and really running the show all day today. He did a fantastic, fantastic job. 2 quick last reminders. We will be sending out a survey, and we have CIP credits for those that are interested that fill out the survey. You can contact us at our regulatory at catalyst.harvard.edu email if you have any questions. For those online, which I'm sure have been tapering off during this this last recap, once you log off, you'll receive a link right away, but we'll be sending one out probably tomorrow morning or afternoon. Thank you all for coming. We have some food if you're hungry in the back. Feel free to stick around as long as you'd like. Thank you.